Hi guys, I'm going to share a book that I read recently that I really recommend, and that is Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, and he is the Prime Minister and founder of modern Singapore. And it's an amazing book which basically introduces a bit about what it was like what the challenges were for him to create and build Singapore. Check out what Charlie Munger had to say about Lee Kuan Yew.
We have a question from Stephen Chen. Charlie, you have been a long-time admirer of Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew. You once said that study the life and work of Lee Kuan Yew, you are going to be flabbergasted. I would be curious to know, how did you start your interest about Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew, and have you met Lee Kuan Yew in person, and if there is one thing the world could learn from Singapore now, what would that be?
Well, Lee Kuan Yew had the best record as a nation builder. If you're willing to count small nations in the group, he had probably the best record that ever existed in the history of the world. He took over a malarial swamp with no army, no nothing. And pretty soon he turned that into this gloriously prosperous place. And his method for doing it was so simple. You know, the mantra he said over and over again was very simple. He said, figure out what works and do it. Now, it sounds like anybody would know that made sense. But, you know, most people don't do that. They don't work that hard at figuring out what works and what doesn't. And they don't just keep everlastingly at it the way he did. And again, he was a very smart man, and he had a lot of good ideas, and he absolutely took over a malarial swamp and turned it into modern Singapore in his own lifetime. It was absolutely incredible. And he did not have, it was a one-party system, but he could always be removed by the electorate. He was not a dictator. And he was just so good. He was death on corruption, which was a very good idea. And in fact, there's hardly anything he touched he didn't improve. When I look at modern Singapore health system, it costs 20% of what the American system costs. And of course, it works way better than our medical system. And that's entirely due to the practical talent of Lee Kuan Yew. Just time after time, he would choose the right system. And in Singapore, you get a savings account the day you're born. And if you don't spend the money, you and your heirs get to spend it eventually. In other words, it is your money. So that to some extent, everybody buying medical service in Singapore is paying for it himself. And of course, people behave more sensibly when they're spending their own money. He just, time after time, he would do something like that recognized reality and worked way better than what other people were doing. And there aren't that many people like Lee Kuan Yew that have ever lived. So of course I admire him. I have a bust of Lee Kuan Yew in my house. I admire him that much.
This is a guy who took Singapore, which brought Singapore into a very modern, successful country and city, which is one of the top and most attractive cities around the world. And he talks about how he did that. And he talks also about some of the challenges that they face, and also his relationships with other countries and how he thinks about them. And he speaks very frankly about what he thinks about other countries, and maybe some people may not be happy with some of the things that he said, but I think that it's very interesting to hear his opinions. One of the reasons that he believes Singapore is so successful is because they are very internationally minded and use English as the national language, which is very smart, because English is the international language, and it gives Singapore lots of opportunities to engage in the whole world, and it makes it very welcoming for the international community. National language of English, instead of using Malay or Chinese or any Indian language or Indian or any other language, means that it's much easier to make everyone be equal because English is an international language. He also talks about one of the reasons he thinks it's so successful is because the Prime Minister and the politicians are paid very highly compared to other international countries. So the actual salary of the Prime Minister that he was paid was over 2 million Singapore dollars, which is 1.6 million US dollars, which is almost 10 times what they're paid in US and UK. But it also makes sense because if you think about it, they want to attract the best people to be the leader, and it's one of the most important jobs in the country, so it should be paid higher to attract people. Otherwise, the problem with not paying people highly is because it means only people who are very wealthy already will come into power, such as Donald Trump, or people will come into power and then after they have left office they will look at ways to make money from their reputation, such as by giving lots of expensive speeches. But actually, if they are paid fairly and what it is worth, like over $1 million, then it will attract all the people who are getting these salaries in companies to become a leader or to go into politics. So the book is one man's view of the world, and so he goes through all the different countries and gives his opinion about the different countries. He looks at Japan and basically says that there's a lot of challenges in Japan and the falling population, and that it definitely needs immigration, but the problem with Japan is that it's very homogenous, so it's very hard for foreigners to integrate into Japanese culture. But he suggests that they could bring in people from neighboring Asian countries that could integrate more easily. And so he is also talking about Singapore and how Singapore's birth rates are falling like everywhere else in the world, and why it's so important for them to bring in immigration. But then he talks about the challenges that they face in having such a dense population, and which is even denser than Hong Kong. So then he looks at India, and he has not a very he can see a lot of challenges in India because it's quite divided. They don't speak a single language. It's very hard for the leader to communicate with the whole country, so he believes it's a very divided country, and especially the caste system, which he thinks it's very negative on the country to have a caste system where people can't intermarry in different levels, and it's not very good for social. It's a negative thing for the country. He also talks about China, and he says that China all through history. So Lee Kuan Yew, his family is from China originally, and he has an understanding, and he also has visited China many years, and he also mentioned that Deng Xiaoping came to Singapore and saw what they were doing in Singapore, and were learning about how they can open up the economy. And but he says the main thing about China is that it's always been centralized, always has a central power, and that's the really important thing in China. But he also says that that's a challenge for innovation, to have this challenge for innovation. He said things like that in the speeches. There's a lot more interesting things that he said that you can check out in the book about China. And on his relationship between US and China, he believes that Singapore can cooperate closely with both Singapore and with all of the areas, and he says that actually they have to, and they have no choice, because China is the dominant power in the region, and they have to cooperate and work closely with all of the countries. And so that's where he sees Singapore's role. And he looks at Europe, and he has a very negative view about Europe, the integration of Europe, and he also says the same thing which he said about India, which is that it needs to have a central language, and if it had one language in Europe, it would make it much easier to integrate. But because everyone is speaking languages, it has a lot of problems. And he also suggests that English should be the language of Europe, but I think that's very hard to make that happen in Europe. And he also has some very interesting about USA and how they are an immigration country and able to innovate with all this amazing talent. So that's my summary of the book, and here it is, Lee Kuan Yew, and I learned quite a lot from the book, and I'm very interested to visit Singapore, and Alright, thanks for watching. If you like this video, subscribe and also leave a comment, and see you in the next video. Bye bye.